The sound you hear is a crowd at the massive annual Greene County Flea Market and Swap Meet on the lot once occupied by the VICEROY Drive-In. This is the start of Octoberpod. All that really remains of the old VICEROY is its big movie screen. Now, of course, it's rusty and neglected with a peeling, decade-old billboard for a clothing boutique called Rosie's Rag Patch plastered to it. A faded yard sign, "Re-elect Joe Butch Devlin, Greene County Sheriff," juts out of the tall grass just next to it. Folding tables laid out with antiques, treasures, and just plain junk from cellars all over the Tri-County region occupy spaces where families would go to watch a movie inside their car. A few of the old speaker posts remain, and the crackly Art Deco speakers are used to announce flash sales, children who've gotten separated from their parents, lost and found items, and raffle winners. Yet amidst all the haggling, the smells of fried dough from the churro truck and the cries of toddlers who want a balloon, one can feel the ghosts of a bygone era moving silently like a breath of summer wind through the crowd. One doesn't need an opera house to have a phantom.
All it took was the scent of wet grass at the flea market. Ordinary, dew-covered grass trampled and mashed into moist soil underneath, and the memories came flooding back to me. It was summertime. I was home from college and working at the VICEROY to save up enough money to live on for the following semester. My name is Christine, and this is the sound of my voice. The VICEROY was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Geary, who were friends of my mom and dad, so it was easy to get seasonal work there. Like most drive-in theaters, the VICEROY was only open during the warm months. My summer break began sooner and lasted longer than Greene County schools, so the first and last week or two of my break, the drive-in was only open on weekends. But when all the little kiddies were back home from school, it was open every night, Tuesday through Sunday. Those were long, back-breaking nights. I worked concessions, like most of the help, and I remember slinging so much popcorn that sometimes I'd sit up in bed and bag imaginary popcorn in my sleep. It was pretty monotonous work. Well, until the Phantom appeared.
He was our local boogeyman. Well, he was before Emilio Vasquez, but that's a different story. My name is Darcy, and this is the sound of my voice.
Drive away your worries and cares at this historic drive-in, the VICEROY Drive-In Theater, family owned and operated since 1954. We have a wonderful program lined up for you tonight, so relax in the comfort of your own vehicle and come back often.
I was into my second week at the drive-in, the first time I saw him. Lucky me. The VICEROY was off the main highway, but it was just at the edge of town, and just a short walk away from a dense patch of woods. Growing up, I'd heard all sorts of crazy stories of what went on in those woods, and that summer, I found out that none of that changed.
My name is Meg, and this is the sound of my voice. Christine and Darcy were my shift buddies. We'd be cutting up all through the intermission rush, and by the end of the night, we'd be covered in popcorn butter and powdered sugar from churros and funnel cakes. After our shift, when everyone had gone and we'd close up, the three of us would linger by our cars and hang out to shoot the shit. Employees parked away from the main lot in a grassy area just on the edge of the woods. Now let me be clear for a moment. Those woods were always crawling with more tails than the trees had leaves. Ghosts, cryptids, cults, and killers, you name it. Hangman's Grove had it all. That's what people around here called it. That's not the official name, but after an old man hung himself back there, well, the name stuck.
The story of the VICEROY Drive-In Phantom is always a little bit different depending on who you ask. Some say he was once a child that went missing in the woods and never left. Others say he was abandoned there as a newborn and raised by the animals there, or by some unknown creature. Some folks swear he's not human at all, our very own local spook, doomed to walk the woods forevermore.
Now, I don't know about all that, but I do know that whatever he was as real as you are. He'd never seemed dangerous before. I always assumed he was some hermit or one of them homeless folk that set up camp in the woods. And if he was some sort of spirit, he was a mild poltergeist at best. He mostly just caused trouble. Snacks would disappear from the concession stand if it was left unattended. Lights would flicker. Stuff like that.
Some people swore that a hand would go around knocking on car doors if the folks inside were making out. Then they would look around only to find no one was there.
But I know for a fact that this kid, Lonnie Davis, would go around knocking on doors to prank any of his friends who were getting some action. And then turn around and blame the Phantom. So don't listen to everything you hear. But his pranks were mostly harmless. They called the law out multiple times, but the Phantom would vanish without a trace, so there wasn't much they could do. Finally, they hired Sheriff Devlin's son, Raul, to work as a security guard and do patrols during the movies. He was a good guy, and he was the sheriff's kid, and he was big and fit, and used to play football. But even with all that, I still don't know what they expected him to do about the Phantom. Most times, he just found excuses to hover around Christine.
The co-owner was superstitious and thought that the Phantom was a ghost or a revenant or something. She started leaving offerings to appease him, to make sure he wasn't too active. She'd leave care packages for him at the edge of the woods. Nothing crazy. Food from concession, magazines, books, or little trinkets she would find. They had this unspoken agreement that he would behave if these offerings kept being made.
But after Christine started working with us, the Phantom began leaving roses. The biggest, reddest roses I've ever seen. He left one on Christine's old beat-up Ford before the end of her shift. Just a single rose each time. At first I thought it was Raul. He's always been sweet on her. But when I confronted him about it, he acted just as surprised as I was. Then, one night, we saw him.
He was just standing there, staring at me with these dark, empty eyes. None of us had ever seen him before. He was taller than I expected and wore a long, shabby coat. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place. It was the neatest thing about him, but not the strangest. The strangest thing was the carved wooden mask that concealed the top half of his face, the golden paint chipping away around the edges. The painted face reminded me of those Greek theater masks we studied in school. Beautiful, but eerie. Unsettling, even. He was like a statue that came to life. No, not quite like a statue, like a wooden totem. I had thought that Raul was leaving me those pretty flowers. He knew roses were my favorite, and secretly I was hoping it was him. And then this oogie feeling of horror washed over me when I realized they weren't from him. Meg and I were leaving late one Saturday night. Darcy didn't work that shift. And as we reached the employee parking lot, I saw him. Looking back now, he had always been so careful not to be seen. But that night, it was different. That night, the Phantom wanted me to know that he was my admirer. I watched him place the pristine rose on the hood of my truck. He handled it as carefully as you'd handle an infant, and then he turned to meet my gaze. I was frozen where I stood. Meg was beside me, freaking out and rummaging through her bag for some mace, but the sound seemed muffled to me as I watched the Phantom, almost entranced by him. He put a finger to his lips, gave a low bow, and vanished. I must have stared at that rose all night when I got home, though at the time, I couldn't quite say why.
My name is Raul Devlin, and this is the sound of my voice. We moved here from Charleston when I was in 5th grade. I went to school with all them VICEROY girls, and even then there were stories about the Phantom. He was known as the Phantom of Hangman's Grove until he took a liking to Christine. and that was the first time I ever found him frightening.
Attention lovebirds. The management would like me to remind you that and or engaging in any acts of are strictly prohibited. Lewd behavior and explicit displays of affection will not be tolerated. Enough said.
He killed Carlotta Hernandez. I know that. I didn't want to admit it at the time, but who would? No one wants to be the reason that someone gets hurt, let alone murdered. I know what people said, what they will say, but I never asked him to do it. I mean, she was a bitch to me, but she was still a human being. She still was someone's mother, and she was still someone's little girl. Carlotta, everyone called her Lottie, was a mean girl. She bullied me back in high school, and she hadn't changed much as an adult. I'll admit that when I found out she worked at the drive-in, I almost turned down the job. But college is expensive, and living isn't much cheaper. So, I learned to tolerate her. She did everything she could to make me miserable there. It was like being 14 all over again. She'd yell and nag at me, leaving me with the dirtiest jobs to do. Gossip about me with regulars and start nasty rumors that made the locals give me a never-ending supply of dirty looks. Then one night, she took things a little too far.
Oh my god, that night was hell on earth. We did a Midnight to Dawn triple feature of Orphan, Midnight Meat Train, and Faces of Death. I mean, those movies. Woof. Now, the Midnight Madness was different. We played our normal family-friendly feature first, and then there was an intermission, and the families with kids left, and then the freaks came out for the midnight shows. Mr. and Mrs. Geary ran the box office and the projector during the family feature. Then the Gearys would close up the box office around 20 minutes after midnight and go home. They put Raoul at the front gate, making sure nobody snuck in after the box office closed, and they moved Lottie off the concessions register and put her up in the booth to run the projector for the spook shows. So yeah, Lottie was her typical shitty self during her shift at concessions. A snide comment here, an insult there, and the occasional dash of attitude to top it all off.
What can I say? She was a, bitch. But even I didn't expect her to take things that far. She's always been jealous of Christine and did everything she could to make her look bad. Even now that they were older, Carlotta was hell-bent on embarrassing her, running her out of town or whatever. Lottie was dating one of Christine's exes, this loser named Craig. Craig had saved some risque photos of Christine from back in the day.
Craig had naked pictures of my girl Christine on his phone, and when Lottie found them, she went bug fuck on Craig and Christine. So of course, that night goes on as usual, except when the previews before Orphan start rolling, the show cuts off without warning. The only reason Christine and I noticed was because everybody started hollering from inside their cars and flashing their lights and blowing their horns. I ran out with Christine and Darcy to see what was going on, and that's when those naked photos of Christine flashed up on the screen.
As you can imagine, the unruly crowd started whistling and shouting some pretty crude stuff. I'll never forget the expression on poor Christine's face. She was mortified. Meg ran up to the projection booth to shut it off because she was the only one, aside from Lottie, who knew how to operate it. And as she did, she pressed Carlotta, laughing her ass off. She shoved her out of the way, and Lottie spilled her slush puppy all over the front of her shirt. She got the movie back up and running, but the damage was done. I was furious. Poor Christine was hiding in the ladies' room sobbing. When I went to check on her, I saw a single red rose waiting just outside the bathroom stall, right on the handle.
We knew something was wrong. Bad wrong. After I fixed the projector, I ran back out to find Lottie, but she was nowhere in sight. Truth be told, I was looking to beat her ass. I went to the employee lot, you know, where we all parked up in the grass, looking for her shitty little Honda. After all that running around, I calmed down and went back to the projection booth. I mean, if Lottie wasn't running the movies, somebody was going to have to do it. And when I stretched my hand out to open the door, I felt like a crackle of static electricity telling me that something awful had happened. Soon as I opened the door, I found her.
I get that no one liked Carlotta Hernandez, least of all me. She was the popular girl who peaked in high school and was now stuck in her small town she always thought she'd outgrow. Mr. and Mrs. Geary hired her more out of pity than anything. It was the kids, I think. She had 2 kids straight out of high school. That's 2 mouths to feed when no one wanted them suffering because their mother lacked basic life skills. She was used to being the pretty one that just skated through life without a care. But you know, pretty only gets you so far. What she did to Christine that night was inexcusable. If I had known... I'll never forgive her for hurting Christine. That's true. She didn't deserve to die, though. I had been hanging out at the front gate in the box office and was just about to head up to the concession stand when Darcy ran down to get me. When I got up the hill, I saw Meg frantically pacing by the stairs to the projection room. At first, I couldn't get a coherent word out of her. She was in shock. I told Darcy to call my dad and have him send a squad car out and an ambulance. I crept into the projection booth, only to check if Lottie was still alive. I knew CPR, and if there was a chance I could help her, well, I wanted to help, but quickly realized that wouldn't be an issue. She was on the floor near the projector, but she was barely recognizable. Her face was frozen in a permanent scream, lips blue and eyes bulging. Her hands were bloody like she'd been clawing something desperately at her attacker and her throat. She'd been strangled with a thick ribbon of film. Movie film.
By 2009, the Viceroy had switched over to digital projection, and all the pictures were screened that night were digital projections, except for one. We had Faces of Death on 35mm film and had to project it on the analog projector, the old-fashioned way. And that's the film they found around Lottie's neck. I have no idea how the Phantom made her body appear unnoticed in the projection booth in the short time I was away from it, and I told Raoul's daddy the same thing.
Christine came up the steps not long after I came on the scene. I told Meg or Darcy to babysit her, but I guess that didn't take. She was pale and in a daze. I kept her away from the projection booth. Seems like I waited forever for my dad to show up with a couple of deputies in an ambulance. But as I turned her away to send her back down to where Meg and Darcy were waiting, my stomach dropped. She was clutching a single red rose to her chest, clutching it with a tight, white knuckle grip. Now I can't say if it was my imagination or if the dim shadows on the lot playing tricks on me, but I swear I saw the faintest hint of a smile on her lips.
It was just awful. Lottie made my life hell whenever she could, but no one deserves to die like that. Though, and I know this is horrible to say, I don't miss her. I know it's not right, but it's the truth. Raoul drove me home that night. I was staying with Mom and Dad during the break, but they were away on a long cruise and I didn't want to be alone, so Raoul stayed with me. We talked and watched movies. He tried to make me laugh, and even made eggs when the sun came up. He was always the sweetest. I felt safer with him than ever, and I was truly thankful to have Raoul with me. But here's the thing. I never felt as though I was in danger. I felt shitty, yes, but afraid for my own safety? Not really. The Phantom scared me at first, but I soon realized that I should be the last person worried about him. Everything he did was for me. He was like my guardian angel in a sort of twisted way. Anyways, the theater was closed for a little over a week for the investigation, and out of respect for Lottie's family. No new evidence was ever found except a bit of blood, some fingerprints that didn't match any records, and a few slim flakes of gold paint, just like the Phantom's mask. Everyone suspected it was the Phantom after all, though most wouldn't say it out loud. But they didn't have to. Police had been permanently set up at the Viceroy, taking shifts all day and into the night to ensure if the Phantom did come back, he'd be swiftly apprehended. Sheriff Devlin encouraged Mrs. Geary to keep leaving him her little offerings to try and bait him. But he never came. He was much too smart for that. Time went on, and soon Raoul and I started going out again. My parents had planned to be away for the rest of the summer, and, he started staying over more frequently. Things started going back to normal around town, and Raoul became my new normal. We even started talking about moving in together after I graduated. But then I saw the Phantom one last time.
Let the light of His perfect love shine upon you and your family. Vista Del Rey Bible College invites you to worship at the church of your choice this Sunday.
Things were okay again, and none of us ever saw that night coming. There hadn't been any more strange incidents at the Viceroy since the night Lottie was murdered. Mrs. Geary didn't bother with her offerings anymore, and new tales of local ghosts and ghouls took the Phantom's place. There were even some sick fucks who now said that Lottie's ghost was now haunting the drive-in, and her not even cold in her grave yet. What is wrong with people? A new guy was hired to replace Lottie for the remainder of the summer. So I worked the concessions register with Christine, Darcy, and the new guy made snacks. Sheriff's deputies stopped patrolling the grounds after about 2 weeks, so we were back to just having Raoul again. It was a double feature night. Our top billed picture for the night was G.I. Joe, Rise of Cobra, and Drag Me to Hell was the second feature. Business was steady. It was probably going to be our last busy weekend before school started back up. Then, sometime after 11, around the intermissions, the power completely went out.
Everything was pitch black. Even the street lamps on the highway had gone out. Like the whole grid we were on went down. People started honking their horns and switching on their headlights. Some wise guys kept flashing their high beams. There weren't a lot of windows in the concession stand, so even then it was ridiculously dark. Raoul tried his best to keep everyone calm, but
he was just pissing in the wind. That crowd, especially since it was a crowd jazzed up to see a horror picture next, got wild. I called out to Christine, who had been right beside me before the power outage, but got no response. Then Darcy and the new kid started calling for her. Raoul's spidey sense must have tingled because he busted in with his daddy's police flashlight and froze when he saw his girl was missing. And then we saw, sitting on the counter next to the bag of popcorn that Christine had just filled, a single red rose.
I yelled at someone to call the sheriff's office and then took off running to where Christine's car was parked. I saw them, but just for a moment. The Phantom had Christine thrown over his shoulder. She fought the best she could, but he had a good hold on her, and I knew he was stronger than he looked. Within seconds, they disappeared among the trees, and without a second thought, I ran in after them. I found Christine at sunrise in a little clearing. There were no signs of violence on her, aside from the wounds you'd get from being snatched up and dragged through dense woods. She was unconscious until paramedics had a look at her, but was otherwise unharmed. Well, you can read the rest in Daddy's police report.
I love the grass whereon.
I don't remember anything after that. I remember the lights going out at the Viceroy, and then waking up in the ambulance, but that's about it.
I love my love, and well she knows.
That police report was pure horse shit. It didn't even include the statements they took from me, Darcy, and Mrs. Geary. It didn't happen the way that the Honorable Sheriff Joe Butch Devlin would have us all believe.
I don't remember where the Phantom took me, or what happened when we got there, but I began to have strange dreams about him for weeks after that. Well, they haven't stopped, the dreams. They've just become a lot less frequent. In the dream, he was unchanged from the last time I saw him. Same patchwork coat, same slicked-back hair, and same rough-hewn wooden mask spray-painted golden to reveal only the lower half of his weathered face. He took me deep into those woods, the woods that folks call Hangman's Grove, to a little clearing.
After finding Christine in the woods, rumor has it the sheriff was so pissed off that he rounded up some deputies and other concerned citizens to do some extrajudicial manhunt for the Phantom.
He rounded up an old-time posse of off-duty cops, truck drivers, and farmhands to find the Phantom and lynch his ass. Can you believe that shit? That police are doing that in the 21st century?
The Phantom had a little nest there, a campsite, I suppose. There were several tarps and canvas sheets strung out and tied to trees to form a tent of sorts. In the dream, the Phantom had covered it with pine boughs to camouflage it. There was a crude religious altar, a shrine of sorts, all made up from whatever he could find in the forest. Twigs, roots, vines, and whatever trash he could scavenge from the Viceroy, including Mrs. Geary's offerings.
Voodoo shit. He made all these weird voodoo dolls and shit out of drive-in movie theater trash to do some kind of weird devil worship ceremonies with it.
He showed me every detail of his altar, objects that were sacred to him. And then he spoke to me in my dream.
He couldn't speak. Not really. Not English anyways. They say he could only mumble words in this made-up language because he never lived around people. Like that one Jodie Foster movie? He was feral, like a caveman.
He said, "I have waited lifetimes to find you." He pointed to the altar, and now I could see a figurine whittled from a chunk of pine, about the size of a baby doll. And he would cradle it in his arms like a baby. And then he passed it to me, and I also held it like a baby. Here, in the crook of my arm. The Phantom didn't say what it was, but my dream self knew it was a demon, or a goddess. The longer I looked at her, the more she would resemble me. Sometimes I'd dream this dream, and she'd always look like me, and other times she'd always look like the demon goddess. My whole self was staring back at me in the guise of a monster. Her horns twisted and spiraled like a jagged crown atop her head. And when she wasn't being held, we'd place her in a bed of rose petals. Roses, like the gifts he would leave for me. She had a tail, like a rat's tail, and her claws held what looked like a skull and a sword.
And then they beat him and made him watch while they burned all of his shit to the ground.
I would ask the Phantom in my dreams why the figurine looked like me. He took my hands, and as I looked into his eyes, I realized they weren't just dark. They were as black as the woods around us, inhuman and otherworldly, eyes that contained an empty cosmos. He spoke to me with a deep voice, an ancient voice, and he would say, "You are the mother of the apocalypse, the bringer of a new age, and together we will finally bring this world to its knees, just as we would have done in elder days. For your true name is And that's where the dream always ends. I never hear what his name for me is before I wake up. Something that starts with a V. Pretty silly, I guess.
Black, black, black is the color of my true love's hair.
I imagine how he must have cried. This was his world. This was his deity. Seeing it all burnt down like that would have been like watching them murder his god. Everything that happened after that was pure speculation. Whatever they did to him was the last anyone ever saw of him. I heard they loaded him into his fishing boat in the early hours of the morning, chained him to some cinder blocks, and drowned him in the deepest part of Lake Castillo.
I love my love, and well she knows.
That's not how I heard it. I heard they found the bloody wire he'd used to strangle Lottie with, and they bound his hands with it, and then executed him. Blew a hole in him with a shotgun, and then they buried the body where nobody would find him. I mean, shit. This was Sheriff Devlin we're talking about. If anyone went looking for a body, he'd have to be the one to send them.
Rosie's Rag Patch is a proud sponsor of the Viceroy Drive-In. Bring your ticket stub into any Rosie's Rag Patch location to receive a free gift.
The town got back to normal. The phantom faded out of recent memory and into legend. The Viceroy Drive-In went out of business the very next year. Turns out they just couldn't compete with the big multiplex that moved into Ray Market Plaza. I got my degree a couple years later, and I was hired on as a vet tech at an animal hospital next door to a boutique owned by Raoul's aunt. And then, of course, Raoul and I got married shortly after that.
They had a beautiful wedding. I don't think I've ever seen so many roses.
Last summer, I was out for a little hike, and I decided to walk out towards Hangman's Grove. The trees out there were just as dense as ever. Then I came across this odd little clearing, like the phantom's nest from my dreams. I sat on an old stump to do a sketch in a little notebook I'd brought with me. And then I saw it, jutting out from the ground like an old tree root.
I don't see Christine and Raoul much these days. I mean, I see them around town and we say hi, but it's not like we were ever close friends after that summer. They seem happy, but I hear they've been trying to have kids for a while now and, well, they've had a hard time with it.
I guess that lost clearing isn't lost at all. I'm just the only one who seems allowed to find it, just as I was allowed to find this figurine in the ground. It's the one from the shrine, the one from my dream. And she's still smiling that evil smile, terrible and beautiful as a siren. Raoul doesn't know it, but I keep her in a little hat box under the bed. Some nights, she whispers to me in my sleep, whispers my name, whispers her name for me. But I can never make it out, just the V sound at the beginning. That was about 14 or 15 weeks ago.
I guess this is as good of a place to announce it as any. We just found out that Christine and I are finally getting to have a baby. We are very excited to be parents. We already have names picked out. If it's a boy, we're going to name him Eric, after her grandfather. If it's a girl, we're going to name her Rose, after my Aunt Rosie.
I'll suffer death 10,000 times.
Yum, yum. Sizzling hot dogs, topped with Castleberry's chili, now being served at the snack bar.
If you like weird, spooky, and strange history, then I have the podcast for you. My name is Brenda, and I'm the host of Horrifying History. Are you into the dark side of history? Horrifying History tells you about the side of history that people don't normally talk about. We tell the tales of haunted places, infamous true crimes, the paranormal, and unsolved mysteries, and then we look to history to see where the truth actually lies. Want to get spooky with us? Get your horrifying history fix by subscribing today on Spotify, Spreaker, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
Hey guys, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Stephanie.
And we're the hosts of
Dead Time Stories.
Dead Time Stories,
with a Z,
is a weekly podcast where we tell you stories of ghosts, hauntings, mysteries, conspiracies,
the supernatural, paranormal,
the generally eerie, spooky,
and all around weird.
If you like scary stories, witty banter, and classy broads,
we're your ghouls. Gals. Some of our stories include Eastern State Penitentiary.
No.
And where is it?
Does it so much 12? The Gettysburg Dime Museum.
They were like, show starts at 5, Mr. President. He was like, thank you, 5. No, 7. He was like, thank you, 5. Fort Mifflin.
So the Americans burned down their own fort. They were like, oh, you
want this? You want this? Come and get
welcome
it.
To Philly.
And more.
New episodes are posted Thursdays at midnight on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and Stitcher.
Listen and subscribe, rate and review today.
Hey there, friend. My name's Sarai, and I host a spooky, casual podcast called Freaky AF, where I tell you stories of conspiracies, true crime, and of the supernatural. So if that's your kind of shiz, come check us out. I'm sure we'll be great friends. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, and a bunch of other places. Or you can look us up on Twitter and Instagram. We're Freaky AF Pod. That's FREAKYAFPOD. Come get spooked, y'all.
I'm Edward October. For more true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to ring the bell so you don't miss anything. Or find all of our links at octoberpodvhs.com. Octoberpod, retro horror for bold individualists.